Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to present at this forum, and in particular at this session, translating findings into impact. We've heard from Sam on the importance of getting published, and we've heard from Christian on translating research into clinical practice. I round out this trifecta of presentations with a focus on research and industry. So for those that don't know me, my name is Chris Schilling, and in addition to my part-time role with the Opus team, I lead the KPMG Health Economics Consulting team, where we do a range of health economics and modelling exercises for government and industry alike. I view my role there as bringing academic rigour to industry and government decisions. And what I've discovered is that my clients really value that. In fact, I'd go as far to say is that industry and government are really crying out for informed and robust analysis. And so what I'd like to talk to you about today are a few different things. Firstly, why might we care about industry and connecting with industry? What are some of the differences between industry and academic research, and how do those differences sometimes create barriers for us to connecting with industry? I'll walk through a couple of examples of where myself and my team have completed research with industry and highlight where that's worked well and where it hasn't worked so well. And then I'll leave us with a few potential questions for our Q&A session. But before we go any further, it's worth considering what we mean when we talk of industry. I use the term very loosely and consider all of the following. So hospitals and providers of healthcare services, insurers, obviously private health insurers are the main ones that we're concerned with here. But life insurers are also playing a more active role in public health. Manufacturers, obviously pharmaceutical manufacturers and device manufacturers, peak bodies and consumer groups. And while government sits apart from industry, I also will touch on some research connections with government. So why might we care about industry translation and furthering connection with industry? Well, personally, I think there's a few really strong answers for this. And the first one is, if you want your research to be used, connecting with industry is simply a great way to achieve that goal. Industry can and do use your finding to inform real business decisions. I mean, as a researcher, I don't think there's too many better feelings than actually seeing your work be put into practice. As a CRE too, I note that a fundamental requirement of a CRE is to improve and focus on translation analysis. And so I think there's, as I said, a real fundamental requirement for us as a CRE to make sure we are connecting with industry. Obviously, on the personal level, grants and promotions these days require evidence of translation, and so a great way to tick those boxes is to connect with industry. But another area which I think is really important, sometimes overlooked, is that actually connecting with industry can provide new research opportunities. And I think of the work that we've done with Medibank, that's one of my examples, in a couple of minutes, where really that connection allows access to new data that we never would have been able to get access to without that connection. It's not just the data, but also insights, knowledge and expertise. And so that connection can actually help to improve the research that we do. And finally, there's a really pragmatic reason for why we might care about industry and want to connect with them. And that's because there's funding opportunities. And as researchers, we really need to be aware of those. And I'll touch on that in my next slide. Obviously, the impact of COVID-19 has been stark for the university sector. In Australia, about a quarter of university research funding comes from revenue from international students, so that's about $3 billion worth of revenue out of the $12 billion annual expenditure on university research comes from international students. And a recent paper by Larkins and Marshman estimated that the pandemic will reduce funding for research at Australian universities by around $7 billion over the next 5 years. And that will flow through to a reduced research workforce of around 6,000 FTEs, or around 11% of the total research workforce. So they're really confronting statistics, and just highlight the need again to be open to other opportunities to grow our funding pool. Now, there are some obvious differences between academic and industry research. Number one is typically the timelines. Industry typically deals in weeks and months to make a decision, whereas obviously academic research can take months and years from conception to a final publication. Confidentiality and the ability to publish is typically different, not always, but often confidentiality of information will mean that research in industry can't be published. And as a result, industry research won't go through that peer review process. That doesn't mean that it can't be checked in other ways, but that peer review objective isn't as strong in industry. The research design is typically different. Now, obviously, there's some exceptions, such as specialised cases like pharmaceutical companies that run their own randomised control trials. But elsewhere, it would be unusual for industry to be considering research design in any kind of complexity, and this obviously means that evaluations typically have to be done after the fact using quasi-experimental methods. A lot of this comes down to the different objective functions of the research. So in academia, really publication is a main outcome, and that's really not the case for industry research. A business decision is what they're looking for, and that's why connecting with industry straight away is so important for and so useful for having an impact. In terms of motivation, I've heard this one spoken about a little bit. At first glance, I think people think that the motivations between industry and academia are really different. That industry really has that commercial motivation, where academic research is more to make the world a better place. But if we're being honest, academic institutions are some of the biggest corporations in the world. So I'm less convinced by that in and of itself, but it is worthwhile to obviously consider that there are different motivations to what's being done. And really, as I said, that's from industry is to inform a business decision. Some also have suggested that industry don't fundamentally understand the research process. Again, I think that there's a little bit more nuance to that, and that academia also needs to understand how business decisions are made. So there's a little bit of both meeting in the middle for effective collaboration between academia and industry. And one of the other things that's pretty common to see is just a very different set of research outputs. So once again, for an academic researcher, an academic journal publication will be a main output, whereas a slide deck for a board presentation might be what's required for industry research. Now, obviously, I'm generalising here, and that industry is not a one-size-fits-all by any means. Large corporates might have a much stronger research arm than small SMEs or peak bodies, consumer advocate groups, for example. But really, why I raise these differences is that they can be both barriers and opportunities, and so it's really worth thinking about as academics. And what are our opportunity costs, and what are things that really matter to us around our collaboration with industry. And so to help work through that, I'm going to walk through 3 examples of connections with industry that my team and I have had over the last few years. And the first example is a really great example where we collaborated with Medibank and some other academics, Dennis Petrie from Monash, to complete a detailed analysis of inpatient rehabilitation rates after total knee replacement. Now, going through all of those supposed differences between industry and academic research, we actually found that there were really minimal barriers. Catherine Keating at Medibank led and really drove the work from their side, and Catherine's an experienced academic herself. So she really has a great understanding of the research process and also saw value in really pushing to publish the work. And so while she obviously had her commercial obligations to meet and needed this work to inform her business decisions, she also saw the value in really taking it a step further and investing that time and budget in actually getting the work published. And so we're able to tick off things around the ability to publish in that peer review. The motivation was really clear between all of us, and that was to try and improve the efficiency of the system, and so to highlight areas where there was really obvious examples of low value care. So we were really aligned in terms of our motivation. And there are really clear synergies between the partnership. Medibank had a really strong understanding of their interactions with their hospitals and the providers of the service, as well as great data on their clients. We brought that econometric expertise together with Dennis from Monash to be able to do the work to a really robust level. And so this is a really great example where our findings straight away had really strong impact, both directly at Medibank in terms of how they actually provide funding and negotiate with providers around rehabilitation after surgery, as well as being able to tick those academic boxes. And so the paper's been highly cited and been influential in Australia at highlighting that just the stark volumes of low value care and inpatient rehabilitation. The second example is an evaluation of a weight loss intervention for treatment of osteoarthritis. And it's an example where I can't go into detail because of its confidential nature. It's an example where we have completed the work in around 8 to 9 weeks, so in really tight time frames, where the ability to publish is still being discussed, but it probably won't happen, where a research design really had to be a quasi-experimental method after the fact, because it hadn't been designed in a way that would automatically create a control group. But despite those barriers, where the motivation and the understanding of the research process was really aligned, and where our experience as academics, and I've reached out to Michelle Dowsey to really help and get her experience in understanding obesity and osteoarthritis and joint replacement outcomes, has really helped to improve the level of sophistication of the analysis that has been provided for this industry corporation. And that's meant that they have been able to make really clear business decisions, and so we have been able to make that jump from findings of research to actually changes to business decisions that have real meaningful impact. And so while some of these barriers have really still been highlighted red, I still maintain that this is an example where, as academics, we can still have a really strong impact on the wider outcomes of the population by actually using industry to facilitate that. So not perfect and not all green and easy for academics, but certainly worthwhile nonetheless. And my final example is of some government evaluations that we've done over the last few years, where in hindsight, I'm not sure of the value of the collaboration. When we walk through the barriers, all of those have remained, really tight timeframes, confidentiality requirements, and an inability to publish or to peer review any of the work, poor research design, no control groups, limited data, and even our motivations weren't necessarily aligned. The decision-making process seemed to have already been made in a lot of these areas, and so a lot of cases it felt like tick-the-box exercises. And so really no clear synergies. And I raise this example because we've all got opportunity costs, and we all want to make sure that the time we spend on our research delivers the biggest bang for our buck. And so it is important to understand the red flags where that might not be the case, and where, redirecting our efforts to other collaborations might be more beneficial. And so if I just make some final personal observations from those examples, I think I can categorically say without any doubt that industry really do benefit from more robust analysis, and they do really value it. And from a researcher's perspective, it's pretty great to see that your findings do directly impact on business decisions. And those decisions happen quickly too. I remember some work we did with Medibank where, the findings were translated into a business decision within a matter of weeks. It is worth highlighting, though, that often it may require us to step outside our comfort zone. By definition, often these collaborations aren't going to be really easy from a research perspective. They might be tight timelines, there might be imperfect data, and we might need to really, pull out all stops in terms of the research design and quasi-experimental methods. But I think it is important that academia also takes a step towards industry, and not just industry taking a step towards academia for these collaborations to work. From OPUS perspective, I think there's obvious synergies with PHIs, and great to see Catherine Keating here again, and obviously I was spoken about some of the great collaborations we've had with Medibank. There's clear alignment of motivation, clear synergies in terms of the availability of data and the impact that can be had. Personally, I think the government remains challenging. Not always. We have had some great work that's been done with government, but evaluations in particular, I think decision making around that, the process can be a little bit opaque. So I'd suggest that you do think hard before necessarily accepting those type of collaborations. And then finally, just an observation around the different types of outputs. One of the things that we've learnt as consultants is that it's better to keep the different types of outputs really separate rather than trying to do a one-size-fits-all type of output. And what I mean by that is, if you're after a peer-reviewed article, then write a peer-reviewed article. And if you're after a corporate slide deck, then write a corporate slide deck. Don't try and write something that's kind of both. And so with that, I'll conclude by just raising a couple of questions that perhaps can help stimulate the conversation for our Q&A session. Some of the things I've been thinking about as I've prepared this deck are around really, do we as academics have an obligation for translation? I personally think we do, or at least as a CRE, I think it's pretty clear that we do. But what does that mean for you as an individual, and do you want to do more or less of it, and why or why not? How can some of those barriers to industry research be overcome? And if you're a researcher, how do you make those connections? And how do you decide on which of those connections and collaborations are the right ones for you? And then more broadly, as a CRE, how do we as OPUS continue to develop and really value those connections? So I look forward to discussing with you shortly. Thanks very much.